Hello and welcome to Sustainable Sustainability, a series of conversations brought to you by the Stewardship Asia Centre in Singapore. My name is Teymoor Nabili and Rajeev Peshawaria is with me as my co-host and he is the CEO of the Stewardship Asia Centre. Hi Rajeev.
Hey there.
We've got an interesting conversation lined up today. Our guest on the conversation today is Nick Robbins. He is a professor in practice at LSE, specifically at the Just Transition Finance Lab of the LSE, which is a fairly new innovation. Nick, welcome.
Great to see you, Teymoor and Rajeev.
And your agenda is the just transition process.
Indeed.
Of how we bring the ideas of sustainability to the greatest number of people.
That's exactly right. And how we make action on climate change sustainable, to use your phrase, that if we're not bringing people with us, thinking about employment, thinking about communities and so on, the action on climate we need to see in action on nature is not going to be sustainable. So that's the message of what we're doing.
So what we're trying to do here is marry some of the ideas that you've brought into this new lab, you call it.
That's right.
And the ideas that Rajeev's brought up in his book, Sustainable Sustainability, about what it takes to achieve sustainable sustainability, for want of a better phrase. But let's just dig a little bit into your work.
Yes.
Now, what prompted the idea of this lab at LSE, and what does just transition mean in a financial sense? Because finance is where you're focusing your attention, right?
Absolutely. So I have a background in the financial sector. I've been a fund manager. I've worked for a bank, working on climate change really all my career. And I think it was really after the Paris Convention was signed, and you started to see the first signs of, I suppose, political backlash against climate action on the basis of jobs. We saw Trump, the first administration, pulling out of the Paris Agreement on the basis of concern for coal jobs. We had similar things happening in Europe. And it made me realize that in the design, particularly of sort of green policies, the E of ESG, there'd been very, very little consideration of the S of ESG, that it'd be essentially quite socially blind. So not really thinking about the social risks, which will come as we move to phase down and phase out certain sectors, or indeed the huge social opportunities as we ramp up green sectors in energy, transport, and agriculture, and so on. And so for me, as someone who'd been working in climate finance, I wanted to find a solution to this. How do we more consciously think about the social dimension so we can speed climate action and action on nature indeed, but also see how we shape this transition so it can deliver positive social benefit. And then I stumbled across this phrase, the just transition. And it comes out of the trade union movement. It was put into the Paris Agreement. And actually it's very simple. And there are international guidelines, and particularly for finance, I think it can put in a language which financial institutions, investors, and banks can't. So first of all is actually, how do you identify the social implications of investments or loans, and particularly maximize the social opportunities? How can you do that, which is going to think about good employment, maybe in certain areas, particularly focusing on women's employment, increasing the gender balance in certain sectors, energy, for example, thinking about uplifting communities. Second is the managing the social risks, which are going to be addressed, job losses, particularly impacts on communities and so on. And the third is that the just transition is, in a sense, it's also a process. And I think one of the concerns that people have had is that sometimes climate action can be seen as quite technocratic, quite top-down. And so the third piece of the transition is social dialogue, stakeholder involvement, which again, stakeholder engagement has been quite a standard part of corporate responsibility, but this is actually making it a real part, so you get that social license and public trust for what can often be quite disruptive. So opportunity, risk, dialogue.
Like, it's interesting to hear about just finance, and I really want to dive deeper into it. But can we step back a little bit?
Yes.
Right? The whole world is talking about sustainability these days, right? There's over $40 trillion in ESG firms. That's a third of all assets under management, right? Over 100 countries have passed recent legislation, ESG-related legislation, right?
Absolutely.
There's no shortage of regulation because a lot of people say sticks are the answer. And there's incentives galore, tax incentives, green incentives, and now they're linking CEO compensation with ESG markers. So cheaper capital, regulation, incentive galore. why are we going in the wrong direction? Why are we going towards 2.7 degrees rather than 1.5 degrees? Why is inequality increasing rather than decreasing? And why is suddenly cyber crime more profitable than the drug trade?
It's a big question. I think, particularly on sustainability issues, we have sort of two sets of issues. One, as the economists call it, we have market failures in the real economy. Not only do we not price the costs of pollution from energy companies or the cost of destruction of nature, but in many cases, in most of our countries, we actually subsidize the wrong things. So we subsidize polluters, we subsidize farmers to actually damage nature. So the fundamental price signals in the real economy, let's call it, if we want to call it that, are often very miscued. And then in the financial system, we actually have incentive regimes, and particularly which reward the short term. So a lot of our risk processes are organized around the short term, quarterly reporting and so on. So even though discounted cash flow will look out sort of into the second decade, most people are acting in a very, very short term. So we have a short-termism problem. And in short-termism, they don't pick up maybe some of these long-term trends. So I think what we have is potentially we have a lot of activity on ESG. It's largely process-based. And not enough of it is really focused on outcomes, which is what most of business and finance goes on about. And that's where the focus on net zero, reaching zero emissions in our global economy, is an important shift, because now the focus is on companies, banks, investors actually getting to net zero. So it's an outcome we want to achieve. It's not just the process and the standards you go through to achieve it. And that, I think, is really changing things. So in a sense, we may have the impression of a lot of activity, but what has happened is actually that ESG funds has not necessarily led to more finance going into green investments, and there's a mismatch there.
And your answer to that is just transition.
Just transition is one answer to that. So I think one answer is clearly we need to get the market's signals pointing right. So stop subsidizing polluters, making polluters pay the price. But recognizing as you're doing that, that's going to have a disruptive effect. The companies which we thought were profitable actually are undermining the natural capital, and they're going to become less and less profitable. So we're going to have to think about those social implications. And then as we're growing these new sectors, which are doing very, very well. I mean, renewables is expanding far quicker than we thought. One of the big challenges now, when I talk to entrepreneurs and so on, is actually the big constraint now for renewables is actually the shortage of skilled labor. Because it's moving so quickly that we haven't got the labor force lined up. So one, on the downside, think about this and manage that transition. Not just because it's the right thing to do, we should be respectful of humans, but also because it's the necessary thing politically. And I think potentially in a smart sense as well. So the just transition is part of that.
So we're walking in the assumption that the transition is already underway and is an inevitability. We just make sure that it's fair for everybody.
Yes, and I think one of the things is this is a transition with a timeline. Yeah, I think particularly on energy, the technological sort of trends we now have in train is that we will get to a fossil-free economy sometime this century. But that's not good enough for climate change. If we want to protect the lives of billions of people, particularly in Asia, from the impacts of climate change, we've got to hit certain timelines. Yeah, so we've got to move quite quickly, and that means thinking about the fairness of it, and I think addressing the anxiety. I mean, us humans, we often don't like change, and people have anxieties, and that can be fed on in the political world as we see in many countries.
It's not just anxiety that prevents change, is it? I mean, you talk about the incentive structures are slightly misaligned and all this kind of thing, but the prevention of change through mindset is not just anxiety. In some cases, it's greed. In some cases, it's just resistance to change because people are resistant to change. What your agenda at the lab calls for is, from what I can read, massive structural reworking of the financial system. And if there is a system that is going to fight tooth and nail not to be restructured? Surely it's the financial system.
I think that's what's really interesting, and I've been working in sustainable finance for I think about 30 years now, and I think what is interesting is we always assumed, I think many of us, that the financial system was this perfect system and always moved or tended towards equilibrium, and then we had the global financial crisis, and we realized even on its own terms it was not stable, let alone if you think about things like climate or nature and so on. So I think there's a much more, to some extent, humility in the financial system, particularly the governors of the financial system, central banks, I think have moved quite smoothly from thinking about financial stability risk, the collapse of the financial system, credit crunch.
The bankers in London must be different to the ones in Singapore then.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the MAS here, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, I must say, has been really taking quite a leading role internationally in this. I mean, I think came to the party, they were very studious, looked at the issues, but when they came to the party, they did it, I think, with a lot of verve, actually.
So suddenly, everybody is now saying ESG is not sort of the greatest thing since sliced bread. BlackRock suddenly walked back from the whole emphasis on ESG to transition finance, right? So is transition finance the big new thing now that's going to save the world? And how? Simplify for us, how exactly is just transition going to work?
Very good question. I think ESG has come in for a lot of criticism, actually from many people in the sustainability world, and also critics who potentially don't like the value systems implied by ESG, the sort of so-called woke agenda, and so mostly around social issues and social liberties issues. I don't think, and so on. And so we have transition finance, which is a nice vague phrase, and it's linked primarily to getting to a net zero economy. And the things about this is particularly the integrity of this. There's an environmental integrity that actually you can see that if you have a transition financing, let's say raising bonds, and you're going to have use of proceeds, you want to see, are these really going to be used for the environmental outcomes? And we would suggest that as you're doing that, as you're raising green bonds or whatever, you should also be thinking about the social dimension. And then you also need to have sort of the classic.
So more controls will be built into the usage of capital raised through, say, green bonds. Is that the idea?
I think at this stage we're trying to promote innovation. I don't think it's a controls agenda. I think we do need standards. Yes, I mean certainly in Europe we've gone through a huge surge of sustainable financial regulation, which has brought some good things, but I think has made sustainable finance more of a compliance agenda than an innovation agenda. When I studied, it was much more around innovation and so on. So I think there's so much regulation. So I think we need to recognize that regulation is useful, but it has a cost. Yeah, it has a cost, and that cost has to be proportionate to the outcome you're trying to achieve.
Not only is it a cost, it also, I mean, regulation can only go this far. It can minimize harm, but you just talked about innovation.
That's right.
You can't legislate innovation, right?
Absolutely. No, exactly. And in many sense, I mean, I see sort of regulation as an expression of our collective knowledge. Yeah, that you actually recognize that certain issues are dangerous, seatbelts in cars and so on, and you implement that through regulation as collective. You don't have to learn it for yourself. We have collective knowledge. That means often you do need to have an innovation. You need people actually to innovate, to break bounds and to develop practice. And then when you've had the implementation and so on, regulation, particularly in finance, can take you from, I don't know, 30% adoption through to those who are sort of slow and so on and don't want to really go with the program. So I think regulation, if you see it as that, I think it's less heavy perhaps.
Just to come back one last time to the issue of the 40 trillion in ESG funds.
Yeah.
So we are now transitioning from ESG funds to just transition or transition finance, right? What exactly went wrong with the 40 plus trillion? And it's growing, I believe, at a CAGR of 12%, right? If that didn't get to climate action,
yes,
how is tomorrow going to be different? What are you unearthing at your lab?
So maybe if we unpack it a bit, I mean, within the global financial system, we have about 500 trillion in assets. And we now have, I think, about 150 trillion of that committed to net zero. So And then the figure you're citing is 40 trillion in ESG, which are investment funds within that that have a variety of ESG objectives. Now, that could be simply assessing risks, so actually not doing very much.
Right.
It could be doing a best in class. You're looking at having the best of the oil companies, but those oil companies still obviously produce products which harm the climate. Or you could have, within that ESG category, funds which are actively trying to create impact. So the ESG category covers a wide variety of outcomes, and it's ESG, not climate. So of those funds who are actually dedicated to provide new capital for climate impact, very few. Yeah,
I see.
So I think that's the thing. We've had this impression that ESG and climate are the same thing, and they're really not. I mean, so climate is part of the E. And what we're saying with Just Transition is we need to think in a systemic sense. And actually, as we're solving this E problem, we need to bring the S to bear and not see the Just Transition as a separate issue, but essentially it's a bridge concept between the E and S, I would suggest.
But as I say, your agenda is calling for a transformation,
That's
a
right.
structural transformation
That's right.
of the system,
That's
which
right.
in itself is a major undertaking.
Yeah.
But who's going to lead it? I mean, one of the things you have also identified is a lack of global leadership.
Yep.
So who's going to lead this? Is it going to be governments? Is it going to be corporations? Is it going to be institutions? Is it going to be the World Economic Forum?
It's a mix, and the phrase transformation, I mean, again, is something which the governments of the world have signed up to in one of these recent COP climate summits. And I think it's going to be a range of actors. And I think looking at this as seeing a sort of an upward spiral of change, for example, where you do have corporates and investors, civil society also sort of taking action. Governments often are not always very courageous, sometimes, and they need to be shown that new things can work, and they can work at sort of cost, and they're not going to create too much political disruption. So I think there's a huge role for businesses and finances and civil society to show the way, and then get governments to adopt that. And that's where the role of central banks come in. They can come in, they're necessarily conservative, they're not going to be the pioneers. So the big thing I'm looking for, I think, now in sort of climate action, just transition, is to really pull out and profile the leadership from emerging markets and developing economies. Because often this agenda has been seen to be a, let's say, global north agenda. And I don't know your experience, but a lot of people I talk to in India and others talk about this ESG rain coming from the global north and all these standards starting to sort of rain down. Yeah. And in the assessments, companies in emerging economies always seem to do poorly because all the norms are designed in London or Brussels or DC or whatever. So I think if we're looking now, where is the growth happening in the global economy? It's not happening really in the North Atlantic. And that's going to be where you're going to see the innovations and so on. So I think identifying, profiling those cases. So Brazil at the moment, president of the G20, doing some very interesting agendas. India, actually, in its G20 last year, really, really successful on sustainable finance, really making a big difference on what the world's multilateral development banks can do. So I think we've got to see.
Can you give me a specific example of this kind of leadership? You mentioned India, you mentioned Brazil. Give us an example. What makes you say that good leadership is coming out of India and Brazil when it comes to sustainable finance?
So Brazil, very interestingly, it was the stock exchange that first incorporated environmental social governance factors into its listing rules, way before UK and the US, for example. And under the Bolsonaro regime, which was not known for being positive about climate action and sustainability, the central bank, again, kept up its position as being an independent body looking after stability, but actually was very smartly promoting this issue of linking environmental risk. On just transition in particular, South Africa has been very, very much in the vanguard. And again, one of the reasons I'm here in Singapore is to see how things are happening here. But I think if you're looking for some of the innovation, I think that's where I'm interested to see more and more happening. Yeah.
Is innovation enough in leadership? I mean, we have a lot of companies that are theoretically innovative, but we're here talking about sustainability in the long term in an age of climate change. And we're here talking about leadership as a values-based proposition,
right,
rather than just the idea that we've got someone with a strong business plan.
I mean, we've touched on before we joined this conversation Tata, and I think what I think is Tata is a very interesting company from this point, and I think is a company that has a strong commitment to sustainability, more on the, let's say, the industrial side and the businesses that it runs, probably not so much on the financial side. But there, I think what is interesting is the linkage between its ownership model, 66% owned by a variety of not-for-profit trusts, and how the ownership model supports the mission. And the mission is actually to contribute to the well-being and livelihoods of the communities in which it operates. So very interesting. So I think there's maybe something which potentially companies in post-industrial countries have lost, which is that broader contribution to the development of the nation, I think, which companies like Tata have had.
Coming back to innovation, clearly we need innovation for both environmental and social sustainability, right? How can capital play a role in spurring more innovation?
Right.
And is there a role for philanthropic capital? Is there a role for commercial capital? At the end of the day, we need innovation, right? To find profitable solutions that do not increase cost for me on the road. To say that the consumer is going to pay extra for sustainable aviation fuel, or to say the consumer is going to pay more for a green product is not fair. So how can capital actually become a force for innovation? And what role does the philanthropic capital play in that, and what role should commercial capital play?
So, I mean, capital comes in many shapes and sizes, I suppose, particularly where we've been working with investors and banks and also public finance institutions, particularly on this area of how you connect climate action and how you speed climate action with a focus on just transition. So one of the areas, particularly with institutional investors, is using the role as a steward of stewarding assets. Obviously, they allocate between companies, but they hold companies and they need to ensure those companies are actually delivering best practice in terms of the management of the company, in terms of environment. And this is now, the just transition is now becoming an area of engagement. And that's one of the cases we've been profiling at the lab, which is the company SSE, a UK company, where it had a net zero policy, but its investors were saying, well, we understand that the net zero on its own potentially raises social risks, social opportunities. We would like you to see you develop a just transition plan. They've done that. And what was interesting about that, they have gained, I think, a lot of benefit internally. I think it's helped to join up the climate agenda with the rest of the group, because it actually means that it's something which is about the workforce, it's about the community and so on. It's not just a soft CSR. They gained some reputational benefit. And also they were the sort of first of a kind, and the dominoes in the rest of their sector then went and all adopted the same just transition plan. So shareholder engagement.
Stewardship, investment stewardship that you talked about.
Absolutely.
Now, UK started the first stewardship code, and then many countries have come up with stewardship codes. And in some countries, like here in Singapore, it's not mandatory, it's only voluntary. Are stewardship codes working in making capital a force for good?
They can work, but I mean, stewardship is a time-intensive and thereby cost-intensive process. And I think particularly in the investment world, the sort of cost-driven move to passive investments and the understandable drive down costs means that you could have a lot of people sort of basically taking a free ride. And I think that's the problem, is actually to make sure, particularly the passive funds, who can't express an investment view by buying or selling shares, can only do it through stewardship. I think you need to have a big focus, I would say, yeah.
What does this mean in practical terms? What your agenda is at the lab?
Right.
We can talk about this in big picture terms, and we talk about it in terms of the case studies that you have said you're working on. You can give us maybe an example or two of the kind of companies that you think are doing the right kind of work. But let's start at the big picture level. And I just want to quote something from your literature. You say the lab will focus on identifying a few high leverage areas where the mix of research, convening, catalytic intervention, and knowledge exchange can enable the process of trial and error that will be needed.
Right.
What does that mean?
What does that mean? So, I mean, what I think is moving from the recognition. We've had very few people saying we don't need to be considering the fairness and justice of the transition. What they are asking us is how. So we talked about the shareholder engagement just now. The other area we're looking at is then how that applies to particular asset classes. So we were looking at the bond market, which has grown in terms of thematic bonds, green bonds, social bonds, sustainable bonds, and how could you companies, governments, municipalities, and so on, how they could be raising debt through bonds to deliver climate action, let's say, but doing that in a way that supports a just transition. So, for example, you could have a green bond being issued by a renewables company to finance the expansion of renewables. But as part of that, you would have positions on workforce development, on actually community assessment of community impacts, maybe sharing some of the benefits and so on. You could have a social bond being issued to finance entrepreneurship development in a region affected by the closure of coal mines and so on. A sovereign bond could be issued by a government, which could be both investing in green, but actually we probably want governments not to be spending so much on the environment. We want the markets, but governments do education spending. They do a lot of regional finance. So we're thinking about how governments could actually raise a bond for just transition to how they're going to be financing changing curricula and training programs, upskilling workers and so on. So that is where we want to get it quite practical in terms of how you can use these mechanisms. And that's what we're hearing sort of investors and banks are quite interested in doing. So that's, I think, one of the frontline areas we're looking at.
It's 2035. Mm-hmm. And your lab has been supremely successful in convincing both governments around the world as well as big business around the world in doing what's the right thing to do for just transitions, right?
Right.
So what are governments doing differently and what is big business doing differently? 2035. All thanks to the success you've had at the lab.
We wouldn't claim that. I think we're going to be a very small part of anything like that. But that's a good horizon. That's 10 years out. I think we will have been able to show that climate action, and I'll come on to sort of nature action, that we've been able to speed that by this attention to the social issues. You will see it probably, so that's in the real world. I think you'll see it much more in terms of, you were talking about earlier, policies. You'll see much more evidence of banks, companies having policies, but also being able to have metrics to report on their just transition outcomes by that. I think you will see results in terms of potentially more cohesive societies and so on. We won't have solved everything. I mean, I think we'll have proven that it's possible. Mm-hmm. There'll be many things, particularly in this region, which obviously many big countries such as India have yet to peak their emissions. Mm-hmm. So there'll be a long tail. I mean, India, its net zero target is 2070, for example. But by 2035, I think you ought to be able to show how you can marry the big ramp up in renewables, rollout of electric vehicles, green hydrogen with good jobs growth in India. So I think that's it. It will become more natural. And I think where we'll need to focus is then how the rest will need to, the residual fossil fuel areas. And then I think particularly this area of nature, agricultural systems, forests, the oceans and so on, which I think are much more difficult because the technological solutions we have are not as yet as well developed, as not as yet ready to scale. But I would have thought it'd be more natural, and probably the expression in normal language is that people would not be using just transition, let's say, just as wallpaper, but actually will have, every CEO will be able to tell without a script prepared by the communications department what it means for his or her business.
And you're net optimistic.
I mean, as I say, on the climate side, I think we can do it. I mean, I think that whether we will, I think we can do it. I don't think it's particularly complicated. I think it maybe means new processes. There are sort of big distributional issues at stake. A lot of countries and a lot of industries still make a lot of excess profits out of particularly fossil fuels and so on. So it's not an easy process. But I'm relatively confident. Yeah.
Give me an example of the kind of company, process, case study that you're going to be championing in this context.
So we mentioned one already in my own country, the UK, SSE. A couple we got in the pipeline, which I'll touch on. One is a renewable energy company in India called Ayana, which was initially set up by British International Investment, which is the UK DFI, and how they have incorporated sort of just transition, and particularly a focus on employment and employment of women in the rollout of their solar plants. So that's one in India. And then we have one coming out of Chile, a French company called Engie, which has at the corporate level a just transition policy. But this is Engie Chile. 40% of its fleet is coal-fired power stations. It wants to move to zero renewables, energy storage, and it's about a sustainability-linked loan, which was facilitated by the International Finance Corporation, and to move from 40% coal to zero, with particular consideration for the coal workers and gas workers and so on, but also big emphasis on gender and the advancement of women. The interesting story about that is that it was some of this loan issued, I think it's a 400 million sustainability loan issued by Engie Chile, was then bought by a Dutch fund manager, ILX. And one of the challenges was actually communicating this transition finance story, which you were talking about earlier, Rajeev, of moving from high carbon to zero carbon. And I think a sort of a concern by some of the Dutch investors that meant they were buying coal. Well, yes, you're buying a company which has coal now, but it wants to move to zero. And so understanding that transition, and therefore somehow how sustainable finance regulation saying, focusing on where you are now rather than where you were going to get to. And I think that's the focus. So that's a third case study, and we got a few others in the pipeline.
Are these companies that you're talking about sustainable in a business sense? Because one of the themes that we are talking about all the time is doing well by doing good, and doing well means being able to survive as a business and be sustainable as a business in order to achieve the goals that you're trying to achieve. So to what extent, where is the balance in the kind of field that you're working in between achieving those justness in the transition and maintaining your own corporate and profitability and sustainability in that sense?
Yeah. I mean, I haven't looked in detail at the sort of profit and loss and forecast for these companies, but they all seem to be sound and robust, and particularly the company I know best, which is SSE in the UK. I think, in a sense, the just transition part is part of them being very resilient over the long term, I think, because they're a very long-lived company and think a long time. So I think it's in a sense, and also we talked a lot about innovation, and I think one of the issues is perhaps not to see the just transition as anything particularly new. It's about the application of really quite long-standing principles, which is to respect other people, to support the vulnerable through transitions, and these are not very new principles. So one of the things I think when we talk to investors, why they are interested in this is because their sense is that companies that are good at this will be better long-term investments. And one of them described to me as sort of just transition is about dealing with the social friction of this, and the companies that can do that well. And one of the companies I spoke to actually said that that's what they'd like to demonstrate, that by doing this well, they become a better investment for their investors because they've reduced the risk of transition, built their human capital, and therefore are more resilient to
I think we agree with you, because if we are going to save the planet, and if we're going to save humanity with it, we need profit. That's the long-term sustainability that Teymoor is talking about.
And can I tell you where that sort of went ding for me? It was in Ahmedabad in Gujarat, listening to the members of the Self-Employed Women's Association, SEWA, nearly 3 million self-employed women. These are day labourers, construction workers, agricultural workers, sellers of small goods, food goods in the marketplace. They are very interested in value creation and profit. It's not a capitalist plot. It really, that actually is a way for upliftment, but with principle. With real principle.
Profit with purpose.
Profit with purpose.
Yeah, exactly.
And for that was also organization. So these were very proud women. But that theme of sort of the value creation element and thereby profit came from them, actually. I was really, not from some big corporation.
Very good. So I was curious, you studied history.
That's right.
And you wrote a book about the East India Company, what
Exactly.
the world. What's the title of the book again?
It's a bombastic title. It's called The Corporation That Changed the World.
Yes, the corporation that
Yes,
changed the world.
that's
Tell
right.
us about how the East India Company changed the world, and why did you write the book? What is the key idea?
Well, I moved into the fund management world in London in 2000, and previously I'd been working particularly on labour standards in the clothing sector, including in Bangladesh. And so when we were looking at that, we commissioned a partner, I think it's the Bangladesh Centre of Advanced Studies, to do a report. And they said, Bengal has a glorious history in textiles and garments until the dastardly East India Company came along. I'm paraphrasing a bit. And so we went to Dhaka and we were talking about labour standards and in the tea break saying, well, this is India Company. Who is this? What was this? And everybody came back, well, these are the people who chopped off our weavers' thumbs. And I'm a historian, and I didn't know about this. Maybe East India Company shints and some textiles and so on. So when I left that and moved to London, to the city, I went to find the East India Company headquarters, which is in Leadenhall Street, where the Lloyd's Insurance Building, some of you may know it, very fine, modern building. And I expected, like in many places in London, to see a little blue pack. Here was the East India Company, 1648, 1858. Nothing, invisibility. So in South Asia, East India Company, everybody knows something. China as well. England, this invisibility about it. So I started to look into it. I started to assess it, and it was a stock market listed company. It had board meetings, it had quarterly meetings, it had shareholder revolts. It had a stock market boom and bust, which I call the Great Bengal Bubble. And what was interesting for me is looking at the East India Company and looking at its sort of organization and its metabolism as a company, and realizing where are some of the things which are important to us today, and where it went wrong. So questions of governance, real problems of governance. There was a duel in Bengal between two of the company executives. We don't have those today. Had a private army, and I thought, we don't have those today. And then you think, Iraq, maybe we do have technology. The company's technology was ships, armed ships. This was the technology. So it was a tech company in many ways.
But it was the poster child for everything that we're talking about isn't, right? I mean, there was no carrot, there was all stick.
Yeah.
There was a rapacious plundering of assets and everything else. And, all the values of the Tata Company that you've written about and talked about and we've mentioned today, none of those existed in the East India Company.
I mean, what was interesting is to some extent they did, and because the people who were working, let's say, in India or Indonesia, as it's now called, before the company became a ruler, they were far away. You actually had to have quite strict ethical rules, and the employees had to post bonds, financial bonds, to encourage them to have good behaviour. What happened was how the executives essentially started looting the company. And so what I found interesting when I was doing this is how one of the great champions of the open market, Adam Smith, he actually added a new section to the Wealth of Nations in 1783 to really critique the East India Company. And he said the two things which have really ruined the opening of the world, one is colonies, he was very anti-colonial, and secondly is corporations. And he didn't mean business, but he meant monopolies, and particularly shareholder-owned companies. So Adam Smith was a big critic of shareholder-owned companies because he saw what the East India Company and how the executive got out of control and fleeced the small shareholders, boom and bust, big mansions in the countryside, famine in India, and then we haven't even talked about the opium trade.
Well, as you said, in this part of the world, this kind of history is still very much known and talked about, whereas it isn't in the UK.
That's right.
Well, I hope just transitions and transitioning in a just way when it comes to climate, when it comes to social, will be a different history compared to what we're just talking about. But thank you very much. It's been fascinating talking to you.
Thanks, Rajeev. Thanks, Teymoor.